The workshop had always been my sanctuary. The scent of sawdust, the steady rhythm of my hands shaping something from nothing, it was the only place where I felt completely in control. No matter what was going on outside these walls, the moment I stepped inside, everything else faded. The weight of the world, the stresses of marriage, work, bills, it all became distant, reduced to the simple task of wood meeting metal, of crafting something real and tangible with my own two hands. That night, I had been lost in my work, the familiar hum of the table saw filling the air as I shaped a piece of mahogany. It was meant to be a new bookshelf for the living room, something Linda had casually mentioned wanting months ago. I hadn't told her I was working on it. I thought maybe it could be a surprise, a small act to show her I was still listening, still thinking about her. But as I turned off the saw and wiped the sweat from my brow, I noticed her standing in the doorway. She had been there for a while, long enough that the silence between us had weight. Her arms were crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. Not angry, not sad, just blank. It was the kind of look someone wore when they had already made up their mind. My heart tightened, though I wasn't sure why. "Everything okay?" I asked, setting the wood down on the workbench. She hesitated, just for a second, and then she said it. "You're just a father to me." Nothing more. The words didn't hit all at once. It was like a slow unraveling, each syllable pulling apart something I hadn't realized was fraying. I let out a short, breathy laugh, the kind that happens when your brain can't quite process what it's hearing. "What?" She didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. I stared at her, waiting for some kind of explanation, some additional sentence that would put this into context. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the overhead light, the scent of sawdust thick in the air, and the distance between us, wider than it had ever felt before. She shifted her weight, arms still crossed, as if bracing herself for an argument. But I didn't have one to give. What was there to say? "Okay," I finally muttered, though I wasn't even sure what I was agreeing to. Her face remained unchanged. No anger. No sadness. No guilt. That hurt more than anything else. I had spent years trying to be the best version of myself for this marriage. I worked long hours to provide, made sure the kids had everything they needed, fixed things around the house before she even had to ask. I thought I was being a good husband, a good father, a good man. But standing there, in the place that had always felt like home, I realized something gut-wrenching. None of it had been enough. "How long?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She exhaled through her nose, looking past me at the half-finished bookshelf. "Does it matter?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell her that every moment she had spent feeling this way without telling me was another moment I had been living in a lie. But I didn't. Because deep down, I already knew. The signs had been there. The way she pulled away from my touch, how our conversations had become purely transactional, discussing schedules, dinner plans, things that needed to be picked up from the store. The warmth had been gone for a long time, but I had convinced myself that it was normal. That this was just what marriage looked like after more than a decade. That love didn't disappear all at once. It faded, eroded, slipped away so slowly you didn't notice until it was too late. I stopped myself before I could say it. "Are you seeing someone else?" Because if she was, would it change anything? Would knowing the truth make it better? Or would it just be another wound on top of the one she had already inflicted? Her lips parted like she had something else to say, but she stopped herself, pressing them into a thin line instead. "You should come inside," she finally said. "The kids are about to go to bed." And just like that, it was over. Not the marriage, not yet. But the conversation. She had said her piece, and that was that. No discussion, no chance for me to fix it, to fight for us. Just a quiet declaration that she had already made up her mind. I watched as she turned and walked back toward the house, disappearing into the warm glow of the kitchen light. I stayed in the workshop. I wasn't sure how long. Long enough for the chill of the night to settle into my bones, long enough for the sounds of the house to go quiet as the kids fell asleep. Long enough for me to stare at the half-finished bookshelf and realize the cruel irony of it. I had been building something for her. And all this time, she had been tearing us down. That night, I didn't go to bed right away. Instead, I sat in the workshop, the weight of her words pressing down on me like an invisible hand squeezing the air from my lungs. You're just a father to me. Nothing more. I replayed it over and over, hoping that somehow the meaning would change, that maybe I had misunderstood. But I hadn't. I ran my hands over the unfinished bookshelf, my fingers tracing the smooth edges, feeling the grain beneath my skin. I had built this for her, for us. A small thing, sure, but a piece of something bigger. A gesture. A reminder that I was still paying attention. And yet, none of it mattered. I should have seen this coming. The signs had been there for a long time, but I had ignored them, convinced myself that things would get better if I just worked harder, if I just gave her more time, if I just loved her enough to make up for whatever it was she felt she was missing. But love doesn't work like that, does it? At some point, it has to go both ways. When I finally walked inside, the house was dark except for the soft glow of the kitchen light. The air smelled faintly of lavender from the candle she always lit before bed. The scent used to feel like home. Now, it just felt like something I wasn't a part of anymore. I moved through the house on autopilot, checking the locks, making sure the kids were asleep. It was routine, muscle memory. The same things I had done every night for years, only now it all felt different. Like I was just going through the motions of a life that had already left me behind. When I reached our bedroom, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and through the dim light from the hallway, I could see her already in bed, facing away from me. Her breathing was even, steady, like she was already asleep or pretending to be. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the curve of her back, the way the blanket rose and fell with each breath. There was a time when I would have slid into bed beside her and pulled her close, pressed my lips to the back of her neck just because I could. And she would have sighed, leaned into me, whispered something soft and sleepy. But that time was gone. I turned away, quietly closing the door behind me as I stepped back into the hallway. I couldn't sleep in there. Not after what she had said. Not with the ghost of what we used to be lingering between us. So I grabbed a spare pillow and a blanket from the linen closet and made my way to the couch. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the house settling. It was strange how everything could feel so normal on the surface while my entire world was quietly crumbling beneath it. I thought about waking her up, forcing her to talk, demanding answers to all the questions that had been clawing at my throat since she first spoke those words. But what would that change? She had already made her decision. And maybe, just maybe, she had made it a long time ago. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The first thing I registered was the sound of footsteps padding across the hardwood floor, then the rustling of something being set down on the coffee table. I opened my eyes to find Linda standing over me, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. She set it down without a word, then straightened, her expression unreadable. "You should sleep in the bed," she said finally. I sat up, rubbing a hand over my face. Couldn't. She nodded, as if she had expected that, then turned and walked back toward the kitchen. Just like that, the conversation was over before it even began. I stared at the cup of coffee, feeling something tighten in my chest. She had made it the way I liked, black, no sugar. A habit from years of knowing me, a quiet acknowledgement that she still remembered the details. But it didn't feel like an act of love. It felt like something you did out of obligation. Like brushing your teeth or setting the thermostat before bed. A routine. I took a sip anyway, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue before I forced myself off the couch. The kids were already awake, their voices drifting in from the kitchen. I followed the sound, forcing myself to push aside the weight in my chest long enough to greet them with a smile. They didn't need to know that anything was wrong. Linda was standing at the stove, flipping pancakes the way she always did on Saturday mornings. The scene looked almost normal, almost familiar. If I ignored the way she barely looked at me, the way she moved around me like I was just another part of the house instead of the person she had once chosen to spend her life with, I could almost pretend things were okay. But they weren't. And for the first time, I wasn't sure they ever would be again. The morning dragged on in slow motion. The kids were laughing at something on TV, their voices filling the house with the kind of warmth that used to make me feel at peace. Now, it just felt like background noise to a life I wasn't sure I belonged to anymore. I sat at the kitchen table, nursing my coffee long after it had gone cold, watching as Linda moved around the kitchen like nothing had changed. She wasn't avoiding me, exactly. That would have required effort. Instead, she was just indifferent. She asked the kids what they wanted to do that day, helped our youngest button his pajama top when he struggled, and wiped down the counters in absent-minded strokes. She just didn't look at me. It was strange, sitting there across from her, knowing that there was nothing left to say. I thought about asking her if she meant it if last night had been some cruel, exhausted slip of the tongue. Maybe she'd take it back, say she hadn't meant for it to come out that way, that she was just frustrated or tired or something. But I knew better. The way she had said it, so calm, so steady, it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't something that had just slipped out in the heat of an argument. It was something she had been holding in, maybe for months, maybe longer. You're just a father to me. Nothing more. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a quiet scrape. I'm gonna take a shower. She didn't react. I left the kitchen without waiting for a response, walking down the hall with a heaviness in my steps. In the bathroom, I turned the water as hot as I could stand it, stepping under the spray and bracing my hands against the tile. What was I supposed to do now? I had been preparing myself for the possibility that things weren't working, that maybe we needed to talk, to try harder. But I had never prepared myself for the idea that maybe she was already done. That maybe she had been done for a long time. I stayed in the shower longer than I needed to, letting the steam cloud the room, pretending that the hot water could wash away the feeling of something slipping through my fingers. When I finally shut it off and stepped out, I caught a glimpse of myself in the fogged-up mirror. I looked tired. Older than I had the last time I really looked at myself. There were dark circles under my eyes, a tension in my jaw that hadn't been there before. I grabbed a towel and wiped off the condensation, staring at my own reflection like maybe I could find some kind of answer there. But I didn't know this version of myself. I didn't know the man who had just been told, so simply, that the woman he built his life with no longer saw him as anything more than a fixture in the house. A father. Nothing more. I dressed quickly, pulling on jeans and an old shirt before heading back out into the house. The kids were still in the living room, sprawled across the floor with their toys. Linda was on the couch now, scrolling through her phone, her expression unreadable. I hesitated in the doorway. I was thinking about taking the kids out for a while. She looked up then, her gaze meeting mine for the first time all morning. Oh! Yeah, I said, shoving my hands into my pockets. Thought I'd take them to the park or something. A small frown crossed her face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Okay, just that. Okay. No question of if she should come, no hesitation, no real reaction at all. I turned to the kids. Hey, who wants to go out for a bit? Their excitement was instant, both of them scrambling to grab their shoes and jackets. I helped my youngest tie his laces, listening as he chattered about wanting to go on the swings first. Linda didn't say anything as we left. She didn't ask when we'd be back, didn't tell me to drive safe. She just stayed on the couch, still scrolling. At the park, I sat on a bench and watched the kids run across the playground, their laughter ringing through the crisp morning air. I should have been happy, seeing them like this. I should have been grateful that at least something still felt untouched by the quiet collapse of everything else. But all I could think about was how different this felt now. There had been a time when Linda would have been here with us, sitting beside me, watching the kids play with a soft smile on her face. Maybe we would have been holding hands. Maybe she would have rested her head on my shoulder, making some joke about how the slide looked a lot smaller than it had when we were kids. Now, she was home, scrolling on her phone, completely unbothered by the fact that we were gone. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, watching as my oldest helped his little brother climb up to the monkey bars. What the hell was I supposed to do? I knew what my friends would say if I told them. That I needed to have a real conversation with her to find out what she really wanted. That I needed to fight for my marriage, to try harder, to figure out if there was anything left to save. But I also knew that some things couldn't be fixed. You're just a father to me. That wasn't the kind of thing you came back from. By the time we got home, the kids were tired, their faces flushed from the cold air. Linda was still on the couch, still holding her phone, though the TV was on now, playing some show she wasn't really watching. She glanced up as we walked in, her gaze lingering on me for just a second before she looked at the kids instead. Did you have fun? They launched into stories about the swings and the slides, talking over each other in their excitement. I stood there, watching her, waiting for her to look at me. She didn't. And for the first time, I realized she probably never would again. I didn't know what I expected when we got home. Maybe for her to ask how the park was. Maybe for her to look at me, really look at me, like she used to. But she just nodded as the kids talked over each other, their voices filling the space between us. She smiled at them, nodding along, responding when needed, but when her eyes flickered toward me, it was like I wasn't even there. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, watching her as she pulled our youngest onto the couch beside her, smoothing his hair with a kind of absent-minded affection. She still had that warmth in her, that tenderness, but it wasn't for me anymore. I'm gonna go work in the garage for a bit, I muttered, rubbing the back of my neck. Linda hummed in acknowledgement, her attention already back on the kids. I turned and left before I could say anything else. The workshop wasn't an escape. Not really. It was just another place to think, to replay the same words over and over in my head until they felt like they were carved into my bones. You're just a father to me. Nothing more. It should have made me angry. Maybe it did, somewhere beneath the exhaustion. But mostly, it just hurt. I sat down at my workbench, staring at the half-finished bookshelf. I could still see the shape of what it was supposed to be, the careful cuts and sanded edges, the space where the shelves would go. I had measured everything, planned it out, made sure it would fit perfectly in the corner of our living room. And for what? I reached for a chisel, running my thumb along the edge. A ridiculous thought crossed my mind, breaking it, tearing it apart piece by piece. Not because I was angry, but because I couldn't stand to finish something that was never going to matter. Instead, I set the tool down and exhaled through my nose, pressing my hands against the wood. I had to face reality. She was done. Maybe she hadn't said the words out loud, maybe she wasn't packing her bags or filing paperwork, but she had already left in every way that mattered. I thought about confronting her, forcing her to talk, making her say something real instead of hiding behind that empty expression. But what would that change? I knew how this ended. I had seen it before, in other couples, in friends who had tried to hold on to something long after it was gone. I had seen the bitterness, the resentment, the way love turned into something ugly when two people refused to let go. I didn't want that. And maybe that meant I had to be the one to let go first. The realization settled over me like a weight, heavy and suffocating. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to imagine a life without Linda in it, to picture what it would be like to wake up one day and not have her in the next room, to not hear her voice calling the kids down for breakfast, to not have someone to share the little details of my day with. I wasn't ready. But it didn't matter. Because she already was. The sound of the garage door opening pulled me out of my thoughts. I turned, expecting one of the kids, but it was Linda. She stepped inside, crossing her arms, her expression guarded. I straightened, bracing myself for whatever was coming next. She hesitated for a second before speaking. "Are you okay?" I let out a breath, shaking my head with a bitter smile. "You don't get to ask me that." Her brows pulled together slightly, but she didn't argue. "What do you want, Linda?" I asked, rubbing my temple. She sighed, shifting her weight. "I know things are weird right now." Weird. That was one way to put it. "I don't want to fight," she continued. "I just want to figure out what's best for the kids." "Of course. The kids." I nodded slowly. "And what about us?" She exhaled, glancing away. "I don't know." That was the truth, at least. I leaned back against the workbench, crossing my arms. "What do you want, Linda? Just be honest. If you don't love me anymore, just say it." Her jaw tightened. "I don't want to hurt you." That's not an answer. Silence stretched between us. She looked down, then back up, meeting my gaze. And in that moment, I knew. She wasn't going to say it, but I could see it written all over her face. The guilt, the hesitation, the quiet resignation. She was done. I nodded, running a hand through my hair. Okay. She blinked. Okay. Yeah, I said, swallowing hard. Okay. I didn't fight. I didn't beg. And maybe that surprised her. But the truth was, I was just tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of holding onto something that wasn't mine anymore. Tired of loving someone who had already let me go. Linda shifted like she wanted to say something else, but she didn't. She just nodded and turned, walking back inside without another word. And just like that, I knew. The moment I had been dreading had already happened. I just hadn't accepted it until now.